My name is Jacqueline, and I'm from the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore, or ISAS for short. Just a gentle reminder for you to switch your beeping devices to the silent mode throughout the event. On behalf of ISAS and Aspen Institute India, I would like to warmly welcome you to the Singapore Symposium. This morning, we will kickstart the symposium with a panel discussion on Singapore, India, and Southeast Asia. Before we commence the panel discussion, may I invite Mrs. Kiran Pasricha, Executive Director and CEO of Aspen Institute India, to deliver the welcome remarks. Mrs. Pasricha, please.
A very good morning to all of you. This is a very, very special day. Thank you so much for being here with us on this day when we celebrate the state visit of the Prime Minister of Singapore. This is his visit after 7 years, so it really is a special day. I also want to say how special the relationship with Singapore we have, that we want to celebrate through the discussions today at during the panel discussions, and then the session with the minister and then the Prime Minister. Our partnership today with ISAS is very, very special to us. For that, I'd like to thank Ambassador Pillay for your leadership and for this partnership. Thank you, Professor Ten, for being here, Dr. Narayan, and the two wonderful ladies, Jacqueline and thank you, Sitara. Thank you for all that you've done with us in bringing this partnership together. Jesus. Sorry about this. I want to extend a very, very warm welcome on behalf of both Aspen India and ISAS. It is, for us in Aspen India, our first major program with a head of state, so we value all your individual partnership. I am so delighted to see the quality of all of the participants here today, and I cannot begin to say how grateful I am that you're spending the day with us in making this an even more special day. Thank you, and over to the panel.
Thank you. And it's my pleasure now to invite Professor Tan Tai Yong, Director of ISAS, to open the proceedings. Professor Tan, please.
Good morning, everyone. I have two roles to play this morning. First, according to the program, I'm to moderate the first panel. But I thought, as co-host of this event, I should say a few words of welcome and also to give you all some background onto the Singapore Symposium. Now, this is the second symposium we are organizing together with Aspen. The first symposium was organized in 2009 in December. And we had the pleasure then of working with CII under the leadership of Mr. Tarun Das, who is a very dear friend of Singapore and a very, very dear friend of ISAS. And we are very grateful that we are able to work with him again this time and with Kiran Pasricha with the Aspen Institute to organize this second symposium. Now, the objective of the first symposium was to bring together areas of common interest between Singapore and India, and to see how we can work together to develop some long-term relationships and partnership. In the first symposium, we focused on issues of education, governance, and infrastructure. And we were very fortunate to have culminated at that event with a very useful dialogue with then Minister Mentor, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. So we're now at the second symposium, and the themes have not changed much. We are coinciding this symposium with the state visit of Prime Minister Lee. And we will also be talking about building relationships between India and Singapore. And the themes are still quite similar: business, infrastructure, and education. And we are delighted today to have our Education Minister, Mr. Heng Swee Keat, also delivering an address on Singapore's education system. So there is a great event lined up for you this today, and we hope that you will stay for the whole day, and I'm sure this room will gradually fill as the day progresses. So we will start the proceedings this morning with a couple of panel discussions to set this relationship between India and Singapore against the wider context of Southeast Asia. Now, the Institute of South Asian Studies, being located in Singapore, feels that it has good reasons for us to develop a deeper expertise on understanding India's relationship with Southeast Asia, and Singapore could play the role of an interlocutor in this emerging relationship. So we thought we should set the stage by dealing with this broader context, and there'll be two panels dealing with the theme of Singapore, India, and Southeast Asia. The first panel, which I shall moderate, will address the broader political, strategic, international relations themes. And then, following lunch, there will be a panel to be moderated by Ambassador C. Chakman, which will deal with business and economic links. So without further ado, may I invite my panelists, Ambassador C, Professor Muni, and Mr. Surya to stage so that we can start the panel. Oh, cards. Now, it's my pleasure now to introduce my fellow panelists. Now, these may be faces and names familiar to all of you, but we're delighted that they are members of the Institute of South Asian Studies, and we have benefited immensely from their scholarship, from their writings, from their insights. And together we will be dealing with the first part of the India-Southeast Asia-Singapore relationship, dealing with international relations, strategic matters. Now, I'll introduce the speakers before I ask them to speak together, then they can present their delivery. On my extreme right is Ambassador C. Chakman. Ambassador C is a senior research fellow at the Institute. He was the former Singapore High Commissioner to Delhi, and now also senior advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. Ambassador C has, since finishing his term here, been writing about India and Singapore and ASEAN, and he produced a very important book, I think it was 2 years ago, on India's interests in Southeast Asia. And then on my immediate right is Professor S.D. Muni, a very distinguished scholar who has been teaching at JNU for several years. Prof. Muni is well known for his work on international relations, strategic studies, and also on South Asian studies. He has taught many influential people, both in South Asia and in the world, when he was a professor. And we are very happy to have him at ISAS, where he has also produced some very important books on SAARC, on India's foreign policy, and the most recent, one that deals with China's rise and South Asian perceptions of the growing weight of China in this region. So Prof. Muni will deliver his speech in a while. And on my immediate left is Mr. Surya Narayana, who I think most of you know as a distinguished journalist who has written for many years with The Hindu. After he finished his tour with The Hindu, we decided that he knew too much about Singapore, India relations to retire, so we invited him to come to ISAS, where he's now editor of Current Affairs and continues to write on the topic. So these will be the three speakers, and they'll speak in that order. Each will have about 15 minutes, and we will hear all presentations first, and then have a Q&A after. So my pleasure now to invite Ambassador C, who will speak from the rostrum.
Thank you, Taeyong. Doesn't move, yeah. Doesn't move. Yeah. Oh, okay. Thanks, Taiyong. This year, we will be commemorating the 20th anniversary of the ASEAN-India dialogue relations. I was told to speak on this topic for 15 minutes. I think it's a bit rushed for me. But first, I have some slides because I can't see from here, but I think a little bit on the history side because we've raced through it. First, I think it started with the Rao government. He actually initiated the Look East policy. There was actually no formal announcement of this Look East policy, but it was actually in the MEA annual report, which referred to the Look East policy in its 1993 report. But nevertheless, the PM Rao was considered the founder of the India's Look East policy. By the 1991, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and India has lost a ruble trade with Soviet Union, and also a very staunch defense partner. And that coincided with a very severe balance crisis. The time was only about 4 weeks of reserve. And that coincided with the emergency of a new unipolar world with America. So that time was, I think the Rao government was forced to look for more trade and investment. And ASEAN was one of the partners they thought that could bring in new trade opportunity and investment policy together with Japan and Korea. So the primary relations with the Indian government was prompted by economic considerations. Then followed by the Vajpayee government. There was quite a distinct change in the Vajpayee government approach to ASEAN countries. In other words, that it was added a new sense of security. First, it was a concern after the November 2001 attack on the Indian parliament that there was concern that Pakistan was carrying a political inroad in Southeast Asia. And this coincided with the arrest of Islamic militants in Malaysia, in Singapore, and Indonesia, which seemed to suggest that there were concrete links between the Islamic militants in Southeast Asia and those found in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So this is the first concern which added a new security dimension to Look East policy during the Vajpayee government. The second point, of course, was the rising China's influence in Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar. At the time, China was coming to court ASEAN countries with the promise of an ASEAN-China free trade area. And there was in that context that the Vajpayee government, that there was a clear evidence of a very assertive projection of naval power into the South China Sea. Then there was a continuation during the Manmohan Singh government, which actually, there was actually a continuation of related this Look East policy from the Lao government to the Manmohan Singh government. But he has added a new urgency in pushing for new FTAs, free trade areas, and also economic integration. I think it was also during the Manmohan Singh's government that it was the first time that the former defense minister, Pranab Mukherjee, defined that India would look towards an equitable strategic balance in Asia. It's the first indication that India would want to take a much more proactive policy in our region. ASEAN responded very positively to this Look East policy. The Cold War was over. The Cambodian conflict was coming to an end with the Paris Conference by 1993. And there was a new area of uncertainty in the region because of the Clinton administration's policy that the new Cold War was over. There was no immediate need or urgent need for America to retain its forces in Europe and in Asia. In the context, and because of the rising nationalism in the Philippines, the Americans decided to pull out from this Subic Bay and Clark Air Base in the Philippines. And that gave a very uncertainty at a time when China was seen to be taking a very assertive stand in the South China Sea. The Mischief Islands conflict with the Philippine Navy was one indication that there's a new emerging force coming, emerging in the region. And there was a need among the ASEAN countries, there must be a new balance, a welcoming of new powers into the region. So that coincided with the RAO policy. So there's a very coincidence that both sides have responded very enthusiastically. And because of this coincidence of interest, relations between ASEAN and India intensified very rapidly. You can see from the charts that 1992, India became a dialogue partner and become a sorry. Okay, very quickly. Then ASEAN Regional Forum. Most significant was the first ASEAN-India Summit in 2002, and for which we are celebrating in December this year. I think was, okay. But the most significant in 2005, that India was admitted for the first time into the East Asian Summit, the inaugural summit. That was significant because the admission of India into East Asian Summit indicated that India was accepted as a legitimate player in our region. And subsequently, India was admitted into the ADMM, called the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting +8, which include basically the East Asian EAS members plus Russia and America. And the significant part between ASEAN-Indian relations was the partnership agreement signed in 2003. It was during Vajpayee's government's time. It was a very, very wide-ranging program from energy to FTAs to communications to terrorism. And there was the time when the Vajpayee government felt the urgency to conclude a lot of mutual legal assistance and also intelligence cooperation between ASEAN and India because of this fear of the Islamic arc from the western end to the eastern end of India. But because of the wide range of topics in this action plan, which the first plan consists about 94 items, and by March 2011, only 40% of the action plan has been completed, partly because both sides found that overwhelmed by the number of action plan programs, and partly because of lack of funding, partly because of interest in bureaucracy, partly of continuation of manpower needs. So that's where we stand. ASEAN has welcomed actively Indians' involvement in the region. First, because it offers ASEAN economic opportunities. That since the early 1990s, the beginning trade between ASEAN and India rose from 2.9 billion to last year about $68 billion. It's a great increasement. And during the interim period, there was also a great increase, a very dramatic increase in India's investment in ASEAN countries for the past 5 years, from $225 million to about, in 2010, India's investment to ASEAN was about $2.5 billion. And so similarly was the flow from, FDI flows from ASEAN to India. In 2010 alone, Singapore alone spent about $2.5 billion of FDI in India, which include portfolio investments. So it's a great flow between two countries, and there was one reason why that we felt that India offered a great opportunity for ASEAN countries. The second point that ASEAN acknowledged that India was a de facto nuclear power, and with its proactive naval projections of power in the South China Sea, we felt that India could play a role in shaping both the economic and security architecture in the region. And that's why the reason why India was invited as a founder member of East Asian Summit. But for all this, there's always a consideration that whether India had the sustaining long-term interest in and commitment to the ASEAN countries because of their own preoccupations, or India's preoccupation with the Afghanistan area, of Pakistan, of the neighboring countries. So it's always a concern that because India was preoccupied with their own neighborhood problems, that there may be a slack in interest in the region, primarily because that already in our region we have the Americans, we have the Chinese, we have all the presence around there. So the concern is that we need to encourage India to take a much more proactive, much more long-term commitment to the region. And our view that the impetus to a new ASEAN-India relations will focus on three areas. First is that there could be shared political and security interests. There is no lack of sharing because both ASEAN and India would want to have an open, inclusive, and multipolar presence in the region, a balance which India, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee's word is a equitable strategic balance, which we needed. And secondly, apart from political shared interests, that's not enough. There must be an increase in the economic stakes on both sides. And that's where a more concerted efforts to increase the economic dependence between both sides through FTAs and other investments will be important. And thirdly, there must be also greater public understanding of the linkages between cultural, political, and also economic, and also the public awareness between ASEAN and India. And these are three main areas where we think there should be the focus of future ASEAN-Indian relations. In the context, the ASEAN-India have agreed to set up an ASEAN-India Eminent Persons Group, of which our chairman, Gopinath Pillai, was a member, and which look into the future directions of ASEAN-India relationship. In this context, we were asked by the Eminent Persons Group for ISAS to bring out a special report to recommend and to examine, to take stock of the present relations and to recommend in what future areas where we could move. Yeah. And first, we have some key recommendations. And by the way, the special reports are available outside for those who are interested, can get a copy outside. We felt that the more important is that you must first to build a connectivity between ASEAN and India. And there is no better way to do through the connecting Northeast India region with the ASEAN region, to railroads, to roads, to highways, and also access to ports. And I think we have realized that Northeast India would also be of importance, of strategic importance to India because of its insurgency problems, of its landlocked problems. And I think perhaps by connectivity with ASEAN would provide a way access to Northeast region. And secondly, we felt that skill developments are very important in developing further, particularly the lower skilled people. And we think that perhaps this skill development could, for a start, be based in, say, Assam, in concert with the overall plan in a ASEAN connectivity plan, which can fit into an India's development program for Northeast Asia. This is one of the recommendations that we should propose. And lastly, that we could also develop and eco-tourism in the Bay of Bengal and also in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is something which brings closer the cultural awareness and the tourism potential between the two groups. And lastly, and not the least, and there will be greater changes among the media, the member of parliaments, the civil groups, which is important to raise and create an awareness between the people of two countries. I think in the context, the Nananda project is very important. I think the Nananda project, apart from the university concept, raises the awareness of India is not at the fringe of the Asian civilization, but on the contrary, that India was part of the center of the Buddhist world. And that is important, I think, for us to realize that, to raise the awareness, the old linkages, old civilization, links between ASEAN and India. So I think this is the main conclusion of the special report. And for those who are interested, they could become copies. And thank you very much. That's the time.
Thank you, Chakman, for giving us a broad overview of the evolution of India's relations with ASEAN from a Singapore's perspective, and also an outline of the various developments and concrete plans that have been put in place as a result of this strengthening relationship. Now, Southeast Asia is also going to be increasingly important in terms of strategic geopolitics, especially with America now looking more closely in the region, the rise of China, and of course India's own ascendancy. To give us an analysis of the implications of that, I'd like to invite Professor Muni, who will speak on Obama's pivot to Asia Pacific, and what is India's role in this shift in America's interest in the region. So over to you, Prof. Muni.
Thank you, everybody. To begin with, a big thanks to Aspen Institute and my own institute for getting me on this very prestigious forum. I think this is very important for a person like me who is working in Singapore these days to get involved into this sort of an activity. Almost everybody is talking about Obama's pivot. So many people are writing about it. So I did not go into that, but the very first question which comes to our mind is, what is new about it? US has been in this region for a little over 6 decades, particularly since the Second World War, had huge economic stakes there in terms of investment and trade, have very, very strong security concerns and security relationships. So when Obama administration says that we will make Asia Pacific a pivot and rebalance the whole region, what is new in it? What is different from what it has been? I think a couple of points on this. For the first time, I think from India's perspective, the US administration is taking a much broader view of the region, not only limited to Pacific component, but Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, where Indian Ocean has been emphasized very, very clearly, and South Asia has been taken in. So it's a much broader perspective than what it was. Not that US was not present in Indian Ocean militarily earlier, but that was largely to counter the Russians rather than to take South Asia and Indian Ocean in. Secondly, it's a reasonably comprehensive approach. It looks like that. Firstly, it will reinforce the traditional alliances with allies like Japan, Korea, Australia, Philippines. Then it will build up new partnerships with the countries with which it did not have a kind of a strategic equation earlier. India included, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, even China is mentioned there, that we will have strategic continuous interaction with China. There is a great deal of emphasis even on the regional organizations. Not only organizations, but building a strategic architect for the whole region. There are already regional organizations like EAS, ASEAN, and the US got the admission into EAS, one of the last countries which came in. But it still wants to shape it and with playing a leadership role. The third point is it's restructuring its own military deployment in the region. The recent agreements and deals with Australia and Singapore, it promises that by 2020, 60% of its naval fleet would be in this area. At the moment, it is 50-50. And a great deal of emphasis on Navy and Air Force, with all kind of details which have been rolled out as to how this redeployment would be done. And fourthly, I think this pivot is driven by different forces and different factors. And one of the, if I summarize those different factors and forces, I think there is an unexpressed, unstated sense of insecurity in terms of slipping out of the leadership. Because of the economic crisis within the US, they are still not very confident if and how they would be able to cope with it. And secondly, the rise of Asia, in particular of China, where China has developed through its military modernization, anti-access and sea denial capabilities, which US thinks that it would not be able to move and do things as freely as it used to do earlier. This is also to some extent a reaction to the feeling and perception in the region that US was withdrawing from the area and leaving it to China. Therefore, there is a reback. In fact, Surin Pistuwan, who was secretary of the ASEAN, once said that the US should shed off its absenteeism from Asia Pacific. Now, in this overall strategy, India is being goaded and nudged to play a bigger role. You would recall Obama's speech in Indian Parliament, in which he said, "Don't only look east, act east, and do something more than what it is." He even said that the US-India relationship would be one of the most defining strategic partnership of the 21st century. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton repeated it in Chennai, and Panetta recently in June 20, wherein he said that India would be the linchpin of this pivot strategy, that a great deal would depend upon that. And in order to sell this idea, he told the Indians, which I think India wanted to listen to, that our relationship would go beyond buyer and seller relationship, that it would be a relationship of co-production, even in the defense and military sector, of joint research and development and technology transfers. So the whole question of Indo-US interaction would perhaps be redefined in order to get India on the board. Now, some of these statements, particularly I think President Obama's parliament statement, put some of the Indians to unease, because they said we have been acting in Asia Pacific since the Look East policy, much before the pivot was invented, including in countries like Myanmar, where on which Obama made a specific mention in the parliament. But whatever, I think India is positively responsive to this new strategy. India needs partnership with the US for various reasons, for capacity building, technology, nuclear, global decision making, concerns regarding China and Pakistan. There is an emphasis in India also of a greater modernization of naval forces and looking after Indian Ocean interests. You can see that in the development of Andaman and Nicobar, and I think only 2-3 days back, the question of BAS, which as a surveillance point which has been developed and is going to be developed, and tri-surveys, whatever. So there is an interest, and in all this development, I think India would need cooperation with the US. India also shares the values which underpin or which are rationalizing this strategy, like freedom of navigation. We have been talking about it very loudly. Democracy and human rights, which Secretary Hillary Clinton has re-emphasized. And I think India is prepared for a very active participation in this broader picture, even as a balancer to be used in the region. Ambassador C. Chakmun mentioned Pranab Mukherjee as a defense minister's speech in the Shangri-La dialogue, in which he said we are capable and willing for playing the role of a balancer. Other officials, Shyam Saran, Shiv Shankar Menon, they have all reiterated and underlined this aspect. And actually India has got moved into various triangles and quadrilaterals of the strategic nature which are emerging in the region. US, India, Japan, US, Japan, Australia, India. We are willing. They are still in the process of sort of work in progress. India, Japan, Korea, we are trying this kind of a trilateral action. A lot of military-to-military cooperation with the US. India's always long-standing active interest in Vietnam, in Indochina. I think these are all very clearly give an image that we are quite actively and positively willing for that. Because one of the things which we share with the US and the rest of the region, including ASEAN, is China's assertiveness is making us uncomfortable in some ways. And we would like to see China emerge as a major Asian Pacific world power without putting others at any kind of a discomfort. Now, having said this, the positive aspect, there are also certain cautions and questions in India's mind. And India doesn't want just to be a tool or a component in the overall US strategy, no matter how big is that component, no matter how important is that component. And therefore, some reservations and rethinking and caution emerges on some counts. To begin with, the question arises as to US is rebalancing. Rebalancing whom? Is it rebalancing Asia? Is US rebalancing China? Or is it rebalancing its own interests? As an academic, some of us can't help but go back to the US diplomacy and strategy in Europe, for instance, between the two wars, when Italy and Germany were very, very assertive in the region. India rebalanced, US rebalanced Europe in different ways, where Germany and Italy were isolated. France and UK were made into great partners. Is it a repeat of that? Are there echoes or reflections or indications of any time? So this is a question which arises. Secondly, tying completely and being looked upon as India playing the part in the US strategy is also antithetical or incompatible with various other equations and networks which India has developed, promoted, and is actively participating in. India, China, Russia, for instance, IPSA, BRICS, even participation, keen interest to participate in SCO, because all this depends on India's own sense of strategic autonomy. One of the commentators, while writing on Defense Minister Antony and Panetta's meeting, compared it with Antony and Cleopatra and said that both loved each other, but both also wanted in their own way to dominate the Roman Empire or that region at that. Maybe there are some signs of that US and India has a lot to cooperate, but would not like to completely surrender their strategic space to the other. And I think this is where the kind of a dichotomy or a dilemma which exists in India's policy shaping. There are also rising tensions as a result of, to some extent, of this strategy. Philippines and South China Sea is one example, where China has shown tremendous anger that what is this happening and we would not accept it. And this is where it makes India uncomfortable, because we cannot afford to get involved into any conflict, least with China. And anything which is done which can lead to any kind of a conflict or tension is not welcome. That's why when Panetta and Antony met, Antony indicated two very small, very important, but two indications were very, very important. One was that he said, don't meddle with the bilateral relations and disputes. Don't try to settle them. Leave it to the individual countries. I think this statement also came in the context of Panetta's one advice to India, make up with Pakistan. I think the US and the Obama administration has constantly been telling us to make up with Pakistan. This is a separate subject, but India thinks that it is doing all it can, provided there is an adequate and positive response. And I think the US has now tested the alliance, the partnership, the dependability, the friendship, the trustworthiness, whatever you call it, of Pakistan itself. And therefore, this repeated lecture that you make up with, I think this was partly a response to it. Leave it to the countries, don't push us. And secondly, don't fast pace the question of strategic architecture in the region. Let it evolve. There are countries which have their own preferences, their own preoccupations, and don't simply push them into it. And lastly, I think not only India, many other countries are worried that pivot strategy has to spread out in 10 years. Now, these 10 years, will the US be able to sustain them in its own way economically, and its own way, if there are changes of the administrations and policies, will it be able to sustain it? And secondly, in 10 years, what will China do? It's not going to be a static factor that, look, China as it stands today, and therefore we will do it this way or the other. More because still in some minds, the US-China equation is very uncertain. It swings from G2, that the group of two managing whole of Asia Pacific, to the Cold War or even a hot war. And there are different kind of indications and perceptions. In fact, we were the other day in a dialogue with the Japanese and the Koreans, and the Japanese said that the Americans exaggerate their conflict but move very cautiously so far as China is concerned. And the Japanese general said that therefore we don't put our money where American mouth is. We want to put our money where American actions are. So, you know, and there is a confusion that in 10 years how this US-China relationship would actually emerge, and therefore nobody would want to put in all the eggs into the pivot basket and say, okay, you say pivot, so we say pivot. So there are considerations. Therefore, what will India actually do? I think India will do a few things which are already very, very clearly visible. We will build up cooperation with the US to build India's own capabilities to the extent it is possible. And particularly on the issues of common concern, we will work with the US as far as it serves India's interest. At the same time, India would build cooperation with other regional players. Japan is one very important one. Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, ASEAN, particularly Singapore. And I'm glad that this visit has seen a renewal of the defense and strategic understanding between the two countries and cooperation. And also other countries like Myanmar or former Indochina, where India is doing its best and will forge all kind of diversity of equations. And India has even been willing to go in for the trilateral consultation between US, India and China. And this is what it was proposed by the US. So we'll do that. We uphold the values which I said underpin this pivot strategy of freedom of navigation, democracy and human rights, peaceful resolution of disputes, and join hands with the US and others wherever it is mutually advantageous. Avoid conflict or confrontation with China, but prepare if there are surprises to face that. Because, I mean, any number of Indian decision makers, from Prime Minister to National Security Advisor to Navy Chief to Army Chief, have said we cannot and we should not gear ourselves into matching with China bean for bean. Economically, the Chinese have very deep pockets. India doesn't have those deep pockets to go and spill out money in the Asia-Pacific region. So we must go at our own pace, but avoid any kind of a confrontation because we cannot afford any war, any conflict at this stage with anybody. And give a very clear indications that India is not prepared and willing for any bilateral or even trilateral military alliance structure that involves the US. So that much is very, very clear. On the whole, at the end of the day, I think whatever India does would depend much on what we do on our own economic front, India's economic front, whether we can sustain economic growth with the kind of speed, whether we can help that economic growth in sensible military modernization and streamline foreign policy decision making, where we remove the very sluggish, what you call the performance deficit between India's promises and deliveries. So unless that is done, I think countries in Southeast Asia would have questions. Countries in Asia Pacific would have questions. Even Americans and Japanese would have questions whether we can deliver our words in concrete actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Muni, for explicating India's role and possible actions in a region that is going to be increasingly important to great powers' strategic relations in Southeast Asia. So moving ahead, we will also now want to see how India ought to be rebalancing its ties with East Asia, looking into the future, and for that we'll listen to Mr. Surya to explain to us his views on those. Surya.
Friends, well, of course, all of us know what East Asia is. Actually, East Asia should be redefined as either Greater East Asia or Indo-Pacific, or more romantically, maybe Sino-Indian Hemisphere of the future. This is very obvious because East Asia consists of so many players, both established and emerging powers. For instance, the US, Russia are now the members of East Asia Summit, and to that extent, the East Asian theater has become very wide and perhaps the next big theater in world affairs. In that context, what does ASEAN do? ASEAN, as all of us know, has been the prime mover in many respects for bringing so many major powers together in the East Asian region. The most recent examples, of course, are East Asia Summit, the expanded version of it, and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus 8 Forum. It's a very complicated terminology of ADMM Plus 8, but it will probably be the security wing of the East Asia Summit, the expanded version of that in the future. So where does ASEAN really figure in this configuration? To use an unfashionable expression in a very positive sense, I would imagine that ASEAN is somewhat like a subprime super player in the East Asian region or the potential Sino-Indian hemisphere of the future. And then what does rebalancing of India's relations with the East Asian countries, what does that really mean? Rebalancing, by definition, is not a revolutionary shift in India's look-east policy, which has already been pointed out, was enunciated way back in the 1990s. And at the time when Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, the then finance minister, evolved the look-east policy to the extent they could in the circumstances, in the domestic circumstances of India of that period, at that time, it was, the look-east policy was somewhat like India taking, really a leap into the outer space of India's own regional diplomacy of that period. Of course, India has been a player in world affairs from the time of Jawaharlal Nehru, but for a variety of reasons, India was seen to have disengaged itself from some of the key theaters of world affairs up until 1990s. So, if you view look-east policy as somewhat like going into outer space of regional diplomacy, then rebalancing can be seen as a calibrated spacewalk. All this is for future perfect. And of course, future perfect is not easy to accomplish, although it's easy to visualize. And is rebalancing really necessary? Yes, to my mind, because I'm talking of rebalancing of India's relations with East Asian countries, because India is also part of East Asia in the wider definition of the term. That is, India's rebalancing of relations with other East Asian countries, I should say. The reason why India should be rebalancing is simple. Because rightly or wrongly, India and China are always compared and contrasted in the East Asian region, perhaps for the right reasons. It doesn't mean that India, by being present in East Asia, will be addressing its bilateral issues of concern, either with China or with any other power. Because a multilateral forum, by definition, is not a forum for settlement of bilateral issues of any kind, and certainly not the India-China disputes of any kind. Therefore, what does the East Asian Forum really offer India if it is not for any bilateral benefits for India? The reason, again, is very simple, although it should be also very profound. Multilateral forums, again by definition, are the forums which deal with issues of global concern, issues of global commons, for instance, maritime security, climate change, and a variety of other issues, including in this era of financial crisis in the West, probably the likelihood of a future global currency. And the likelihood of a future global currency would straightaway mean the possibility of the Chinese currency becoming a future currency for international trade and other purposes, alongside the US dollar perhaps for a long, long time to come, if at all the Chinese currency is able to reach that status. So in that sense, India can address some of the global concerns, some of the global commons issues by rebalancing its relations with the other East Asian countries. In this context, what has been India's role so far, and what has been its performance? Of course, Professor Muni has already referred to the performance gap in India's actions, but I'm not on that issue at the moment. Way back in 2010, there was a story in the WikiLeaks, which, of course, WikiLeaks more popular in India than in Singapore. And the story was that a famous ASEAN diplomat, of course, I will not name his name, is supposed to have said to the American diplomats that India is stupid in its foreign policy towards ASEAN. And another ASEAN diplomat is supposed to have said that China is very intelligent in its diplomacy towards ASEAN. And this, the first diplomat whom I have not named, is supposed to have said further that India is half in and half out of ASEAN. But we are not on the issue of whether such a statement was at all made by the said diplomat or not. That's not our concern. But to my mind, that statement, anonymously, not so anonymously actually, the diplomat was named, that statement rings true in the sense that India has not got its act together in dealing with ASEAN to the extent ASEAN has expected, and perhaps to the extent some Indians have also expected. And this, again, brings us to the issue of China versus India in the East Asian theater. If China has been intelligent in its diplomacy towards ASEAN, what has China done which India has not done? Well, the answer is very simple if you happen to live in East Asia. Maybe not so easy to discern if one is looking at the issue from India. China has given in to some of the demands of ASEAN. That's what many ASEAN diplomats and ASEAN officials seem to believe. In other words, China has been more accommodative of the economic interests of ASEAN than India has been. Well, there may be valid reasons for that. China obviously is on a far higher pedestal than India in economic terms. Therefore, perhaps China can afford to be much more accommodative of ASEAN's economic interests than India can be. In other words, China has been flexible, whereas India has been rigid, quote unquote. And if that is the case, why has India been so rigid? Obviously, one reason is that India has not had the kind of economic clout which China can. But yet another reason in favor of China is what quite a few young Chinese diplomats who are very free with their views these days because of China's own evolving political culture. So some of the young Chinese diplomats had told me earlier during my previous posting as a foreign correspondent of an Indian newspaper, these Chinese diplomats said that it's easy for China to be flexible towards ASEAN because the Chinese government and the Chinese political system being what it is, the Chinese government can carry the day in accommodating ASEAN even in the face of, say, grassroots sentiment against, say, concessions to ASEAN. Because of the paucity of time, of course, one won't be able to go into minor, but minute rather, issues of economy, where China is supposed to be more liberal than India towards ASEAN. Whatever it is, the facts are quite obvious. India has also done a free trade agreement with ASEAN, and China has got a much more comprehensive agreement with ASEAN, and China and ASEAN together constitute the free trade area, China-ASEAN free trade area, which is one of the biggest free trade areas. So India's FTA in goods with the ASEAN right now has a time span, minimal time span, and according to some experts, right now the concessions agreed upon on both sides is only valid up to 2016 or so. Well, I will leave these details to the next session. I'm not very sure whether it's 2016 or thereabouts, but something to that effect. So, whereas China and other East Asian powers like Japan, South Korea and others have done trade deals with ASEAN of much longer time duration. And now India and ASEAN are of course negotiating for quite some time now new agreements, potential new agreements on investments and services. And this, according to many ASEAN observers, is something like a childlike merry-go-round of discussions. There doesn't seem to be any immediate sign of progress for an ultimate agreement. So the sum and substance of such a narrative from the ASEAN perspective, which is in line with the facts on the ground, would suggest that India may have to yield some ground to ASEAN in at least the conventional areas of services, say like the professions of medicine or chartered accountancy or whatever. I wish to make a distinction between conventional areas of services and non-conventional or perhaps futurist services. So if India can yield ground to ASEAN on conventional areas of services, India can perhaps insist, as part of its rebalancing, India can perhaps insist on having a better deal with ASEAN countries in non-conventional areas of services. These will include cyberspace security and outer space exploration. Cyberspace security, is easy to understand, is one of the most important issues of the day for the entire world, and certainly for ASEAN countries and certainly for India as well. And India is supposed to have, and I tend to believe that India does have, quite some capabilities in providing cybersecurity assistance or cooperation, rather, that's the diplomatic word for assistance, with other countries, can have cooperation with other countries in that sphere. And India has, as most of us here would know, some time ago launched an experimental satellite. It's a very, just an experimental satellite done by, fabricated or manufactured by Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. India launched that experimental satellite into space and put that satellite in picture-perfect, predetermined orbit. So India has demonstrated, not just in this case, but in several other instances of even bigger satellites, that it has the capabilities. And why does, anyone need to be in outer space exploration? Because outer space, again, is a new frontier area for human affairs. And sooner or later, those spacefaring nations with capabilities in that sphere would be able to command greater access to resources both on planet Earth and in outer space. Outer space, of course, for resource purposes is too much of a distant dream. But the point here is that India has certain capabilities which it can offer in exchange for being flexible towards ASEAN in the conventional sphere of services. And even on the conventional sphere, there is a new agreement likely to be negotiated by ASEAN involving the wider region of East Asia, and that is known as Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, for which time is already ticking. Negotiations of a proper kind will be beginning soon enough, and India will have to decide whether it can be partner in that respect. This can be seen in some circles at least as an alternative TPP. And TPP, of course, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is supposed to be keeping Chinese out at the moment. It's a US-Japan initiative, essentially. So on balance, when India rebalances its relations with the other East Asian powers, India can, at one level, become a net provider of security, a term which the US had used in the past, but I don't mean it exactly in similar fashion. But India can be a factor for peace and stability in East Asia, or the wider greater East Asia, or the potential Sino-Indian hemisphere. And to that extent, there will be some cooperation between US and India on security issues. And of course, it has to be done by India in a very careful and calibrated fashion so that China does not get the wrong and unintended message from India. Therefore, India will, while rebalancing its ties with ASEAN on the whole, must also take care to keep its relations with China on an even keel. And therefore, if on security issues India can go along with the US and perhaps also taking China into account on issues of global commons concern, that will be one aspect of rebalancing India's relations with the other East Asian countries. And on economic issues, it will be in India's interest to rebalance in such a way that India does not lose out on the economic dividends which China's emergence as the economic superpower can mean for India as well. And in the long term, the world may probably become some kind of a bilateral, rather a bipolar world, involving US at one end and China at the other end, although it is not on the cards as of now. Therefore, India will have to rebalance its relations in such a way that it does not lose its plot in East Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, for your advocacy for India to rebalance its ties in East Asia, especially to have greater engagement with ASEAN so that it would have its voice heard in global affairs. Now, I want to thank all three speakers for keeping to the time we've allocated to them. Now, that leaves us with about 25 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to open the session to the floor. I will request that you keep your comments and questions as concise as possible, introduce yourself. And what I propose to do is to take maybe 3 to 4 questions at one go, and then the panelists can respond, and then we'll see how many we can take in, given the time that we have. May I now invite questions from the floor, please? Just raise your hands and... Okay, there's a bit of a glare. Yes, I can see one. Yes, sir.
Just a short introduction. My name is Godwin Lim. I'm the President and CEO of Godwin Group. We are strong supporters of ISA, and I want to thank ISA for the kind visitation itself and kind invite. My questions posed out on the 9th of July, which is about 3 days ago. I attended the Future China Global Forum itself. Ambassadors Wu Jianming posted 3 challenges of China, one of which, the first, it is hard for the world to accept and adapt the perception of rising China. Secondly, is the stress that China has a peaceful rise and there's no expansion needed for the army itself. And the third is the right perception in China changes. My question to the panel itself is one statement that Ambassador Wu made, which he stated there will be no alliances of China to the world, which I disagree. And how would the panelists react to these questions, and how India itself would react to this question itself? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Godwin. So your question is whether, China would make alliances with?
My question is that there is China's, like, I disagree with Ambassador Wu's statement on China will have no alliances with other countries.
Okay.
Right. My question is that...
do the panelists agree with that view?
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Godwin. Can I invite the next question? Yes, the lady at the back, I think... Meena. Yes. Meena.
Yeah. Thank you. As a student of Professor Muni in SIS. My name is Bina Lakshmi Nepram from the Control Arms Foundation of India. My question is to Ambassador Si Chak Mun. Ambassador, you've so beautifully pointed out about the Look-East policy and the need for India's Northeast, home to 40 million Indians of 8 states. But my question is, are you aware of the problems which are there in that region? We want to change it, and as Singapore, and your institute thought about how to get that done. Because in the Look-East policy, we have just got one expert from the northeast of India within it, and there is a problem there. And so just a little question there.
Okay. This is the situation in Northeast, whether we are aware of the situation in Northeast. Okay. Thank you. I think I see a hand on this side.
My name is C. Mahapatra. I'm a professor at JNU and a student of American Studies. Just one brief observation on Professor Muni's point about this pivot, Obama's pivot policy. What he raised a question, what is new? I think what is new are the following. Number one, in the last 10 years when the Americans were deeply involved in 2 wars and fighting a global war against terrorism, that was the time when the Chinese economy galloped more than ever before. During this time, the US-Chinese economy became so interdependent that about 60,000 Americans living in Hong Kong with a residential address doing business, thousands of joint ventures and trade, etc., etc. Same China during this time became increasingly a military concern and possibly a challenge to the United States. Again, the timing is important because Japanophobia has practically disappeared in the region. Sinophobia is lurking behind and getting deeper and deeper into the minds of the Asian countries. China is militarily close to countries like Pakistan, to North Korea, possibly Iran. And this pivot strategy is actually more military and less economy, literally no economy. So in this complex world where a very significant economic partner is posing a challenge to American leadership, and how to address that, now that the Americans want to wind up the war in Afghanistan, how to meet this Chinese challenge is actually the key question. And looks like all the ASEAN countries, plus Japan, Australia, India, are teaming up with the USA if they agree even 50% to the pivot strategy and building a kind of hedging strategy against China. So what's your view on this?
Thank you, Prof. So I think I'll pause here to let the panelists respond first. So maybe Chakman first, and then I'll move down to Prof. Muni and Surya.
Maybe I will answer the questions I asked, that he does not agree that what Ambassador Wu said, that China does not need any alliances. But China was, in fact, alliance of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War days. But at the present, things have changed. I think China has recognized it is a rising power, and in the absence of any Cold War ideological confrontation, there is now becoming a policy of extending soft power, extending its own economic clout to win friends and to try to persuade countries to accept the Chinese influence, and so that China can play a dominant role in the region. In the sense that China has been getting close to Shanghai, perhaps, the alliances, Central Asia. And for South Asia, I think China has felt that South Asia has very much in the Chinese spheres of influence, as much as India look at Indian Ocean as a part of a sphere of influence. So I think for strategic reasons, the South Asia become a very important part of China because of the Strait of Malacca and access to the sea. So I think that in the sense that China does not see the need to form any military alliance at this stage because there's no Cold War. But the question of extending influence, networking, building more bridges and influences is part of the war diplomacy which any power will exercise. Perhaps I will address the question of the Northeast. In what way that do we see the problems in Northeast, and why should we advocate, perhaps in a special report, that ASEAN and India could get to build land connectivity between Northeast Asia and ASEAN countries? Yes, we do recognize that Northeast states in India have their own problems of being landlocked, of being excluded from the external world, and being excluded from communications. And that's very difficult for countries or industries to develop in that part of the area. And that is perhaps the problems which India has to solve itself. I think you have your own Northeast Ministry. I think tomorrow that there will be a conference on this one. That solve your own problems, and by means that which you think will be fitting. What ASEAN can do is that by building roads and rail links and access to ports, by promoting skills development in the Northeast area, which is very close to ASEAN countries. After all, you share land border with Myanmar and a sea border with Indonesia and Thailand. Only through a process that it could increase the attractiveness of Northeast as an attractive development region. I think it's only at the end, it is where you can develop industries, where you can attract investment that will help to promote Northeast states in the longer run. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, first on which is not directed to me, on the question of alliances, I don't know what kind of alliances China can have in Asia Pacific, because they have almost alienated everybody in the region, with barely one or two exceptions like Korea. On the whole question of South China Sea dispute, for instance, recently there was a conference in Malaysia, and the Chinese ambassador and the Chinese professors very clearly stated, where is the dispute? The region, whatever the line we have drawn belongs to us. So where is the question of dispute? I mean, this kind of a termination, the attitude of this, and telling all other countries in the region, why are you going to the US for your security? Come to us, we will provide it. With that kind of an attitude, I don't know what kind of an alliance China, even if it wants to make in the region, will be able to make. On Chintamani's question, I don't think we have any dispute here. I did say that China was a driving force. My only caution to you would be whether China is the only driving force. And that's why I inserted this question of whether US is rebalancing in relation to China or rebalancing in relation to Asia. Because if you look at the totality of the US concern, look at the domestic speeches of the Western leaders, including Obama, where there is a repeated reference that China and India or the Asia is rising, and if we don't do this, we will go, we will slide down. That's why I brought in this question of an unstated internal sense of insecurity of losing the leadership and the hegemony. And therefore, if you have to reassert and reinforce, which from the US point of view is absolutely legitimate. If you want to reinsert and reinforce your hegemony, then you must see that the Asia's rise is slowed down or if not obstructed or if completely, and how best you can do it. Do it in the European way. Put the Europeans against the Europeans. Put the Asians against the Asians. And this could be, I mean, this is a lurking suspicion. As an analyst, you have to take this into account, scrutinize it, and reject it. But to say simply that it is, if it is only China, then there is quite another. I quoted to you the Japanese general who said, you know, you're saying one thing and doing another thing. There is a defense continued cooperation. There is economic interdependence. These are hard facts which nobody can ignore. So all I'm saying is, yes, this is a fact, but we must look at it carefully.
No question was actually addressed to me directly, but on the question of whether China needs or does have any kind of alliances, I have a slightly different perception, which probably is a bit of a nuance. What is this all-weather friendship between China and Pakistan all about? If it is not an alliance by a different name, and India certainly knows all about that. In that sense, China probably doesn't have the traditional definitional alliance, or probably doesn't think it needs, or probably cannot have one. Whatever it is, there is some kind of friendship-oriented paradigm in China's relations. Friendship, quote-unquote, whatever, with Pakistan, for instance, and this Shanghai Cooperation Organization also has an element of some kind of understanding on strategic issues between China and Russia. Then on the other question of whether, what should be India's attitude towards China in these circumstances, one of the possibilities for India, it's just one of the possibilities, India can have or can practice what may be termed as a neo-non-alignment with reference to China, and China on one hand and US on the other, and yet be part of the East Asian paradigm. Thank you.
I see 5 hands, so I'm going to take these 5 questions before we break for lunch. One at the corner there, sir. Can you please keep your questions concise so that we can take them all? Thank you.
I'm Dr. S.K. Pachori from the Amity University. My question is that this dialogue between India, China and the US should be a continuous one, and it should be aimed at avoiding conflict. And in this context, President Obama's visit to India 2 years ago was a very significant one, where he had promised, or at least made some kind of a declaration, that they would help, the US would help in India's aim to get into the Security Council. Now, what is happening about this? Was it a mere hollow promise, or was it just a assurance because he came to India, so to mark his presence here in India? Or is it just symbolic, just kind of a symbolic speech? But I think if India does get into the Security Council, that will definitely affect the architecture of security in Southeast Asia and South Asia as well, and mark India's presence on the world scene in a different way. At least India will be looked at in a different way.
Thank you, sir. I think there was another question just further down, or is it here now? Up in the front. Up in the front first, here. Okay, to the front, first table here. There. Then we'll move on to the...
Thank you. I am R.K. Khanna, a former Chief Engineer Environment with the Central Water Commission. My query is to the Honorable Ambassador. Sir, you mentioned very important issue, development of eco-tourism in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. A lot of tourism development taking place there, but development of tourism, environment, land, water. Sir, in what way you propose this?
I think, sorry, there was a problem with the mic. Maybe you want to repeat that question. quickly. There is ecotourism in
Ecotourism in Andaman Nicobar Islands is a very important area because uncontrolled development of tourism in that area is leading to degradation of environment. Land, water is a very important area. So my only query is that in what way you propose to work in this area, because India Ministry of Environment and other agencies are working, and that will be very helpful in fact.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I think the one at the back, and then there are two questions from the back. Yeah.
I'm Kunal Majumdar from Tehelka. Ambassador C mentioned this about the Islamic threat. I mean, he just spoke about it during the Vajpayee tenure. If some of the biggest Muslim countries, especially Indonesia, is in the region, if one of the panelists could expand on this, because you are speaking about China, but another big threat is the Islamic terrorism.
Yeah. The Islamic factor. And sir, the one at the back, and then I'll come to you, sir.
My name is Mr. Janak Talsania, and I'm a retired investment manager. Mr. Mitt Romney has stated that if he's elected, he'll declare China as a currency manipulator on day one. This is directed to Professor Muni. If he doesn't do so, he's going to be labeled Mr. Flip-Flop forever. And if he does do so, there'll be serious implications for currency, trade, all sorts of political, and we could go back to a state like the 1930s. What is the view on such a scenario?
Thank you. Sir? It's in front here.
Thank you, sir. My name is Vinay Jain. I represent Wordsworth Consultants. I have a question which is based on three things. One is, it is very welcome to have increasing India and ASEAN cooperation. But after the discussions which took place, where I find the mainstream is either the US interest or US policy or the fear of China. I think we are overrating both the things, in my humble opinion. US is already a dwindling power, so is China. China became strong because they were supplying to US, now US is not buying. Chinese population is also aging. And we have people who are coming up in age, becoming productive. Should not this partnership or the cooperation between India and ASEAN countries be more based on self-development, mutual cooperation, instead of fear-based or we have always been guided by, manipulated by Western interests. Should we continue to do so? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm afraid that's all the questions I can take, but don't worry. I need to give time for the panelists to respond. Okay, just one last question from you, sir, and then I have to let the panelists respond.
A brief question. Professor Muni, you said that China has, my name is Ghare Khan. I try to follow international relations. Professor Muni, you said that China has alienated practically everyone in this part of the world, in that region. Why? Why should China want to alienate almost every other country? Is it for their domestic compulsions that they are looking out to create some tension? Why should China want to alienate everybody?
Thank you. I think I'll stop here because we need to give time for the panelists to respond, and then there'll be another session after lunch, and I'm sure there'll be related questions, so there'll be another opportunity for you to ask. So I'm going to ask Ambassador C to answer first on the Nicobar Island and the sustainability and at the same time ecotourism, and then Prof. Muni and then
the idea of ecotourism in Bay of Bengal is one of the recommendations we suggested in the special report which we submitted to the ASEAN-India Eminent Persons Group. We felt that because this is an area where it is contiguous to India and ASEAN countries, and Andaman and Nicobar's Island has been suggested there's one area perhaps both the tourist industries in ASEAN and India could cooperate to develop. Of course, obviously we are concerned about the tribal sensitivities in the area and the need to preserve their own ethnic culture. In fact, some time ago, it was mentioned that even the Indian military had wanted to develop certain parts of our Andaman Nicobar Islands into tourist resort. And indeed, one Singapore company has, in fact, developed a tourist spot over there. So I think this is the area of cruises, Bay of Bengal, Andaman bars, and sort of ecotourism will be one way where ASEAN and India could cooperate, perhaps give very due consideration to the environment, to the tribal sensitivity in the area. On the question of Islamic thing, it was in fact, I mean, there was, after the arrest of the Jamaah Islamiyah militants in Singapore, Malaysia, and possibly in Indonesia, we do realize that there were links between these militants, and some of them have been actually sent to train in Afghanistan and perhaps certain parts in Pakistan. So in fact, I think it was in 2005 that they were found armed caches in Chittagong, which are supposed meant to supply to the northeast insurgencies. So the links were there, and that was, I think, right after the attack in the Indian Parliament in November 2001 did raise a great concern among the government's officials here that they were linked, even though perhaps not very fully established, between the militants operating in South Asia and also those in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and possibly impact on India. So this is a mention that there was a part of the main factor, or one of the factors which have driven the Vajpayee government into a closer relation with ASEAN country in terms of sharing intelligence, sharing of legal assistance program, so as to uncover those links and to tackle them through mutual cooperation.
The first question was on India-China-US dialogue. I don't know, didn't get the thrust of what you're wanting. India-China-US consultations is a proposal still. It has not been accepted by the Chinese wholeheartedly. They have given a positive indication of late, after a lot of reservations. And I think they must be worried that in this kind of a trilateral dialogue, they may be cornered by the Indian and US put together. And secondly, they don't want to still, in some respects, don't want to take India as an equal partner to them. So putting it on the high table, they may be a little uncomfortable. But I think the dialogue, if it starts, good for us, good for US, and I agree with you, is good for the Chinese as well. Otherwise, India is having bilateral, I think all these three countries are having bilateral nexus with each other, whether it's a triangle or not, the relationship exists. Whether US would, don't assume that US can deliver the Security Council seat to India. It's not something which is in their purse, just take it out and give it to them. Because it's a question which is linked to the entire restructuring of the UN Security Council. There are obvious reservations, there are obvious different opinions, there are many aspirants. And it's a complicated question, I think. Though I think broadly, a consensus seems to be developing that there are no serious objections to India being there. So I don't know when it will materialize, can't really say. The question on Andaman Nicobar, tourism, spoiling environment. Tourism spoils environment everywhere. I mean, I have seen people in Kathmandu say you go to Srinagar, huge tourism there, and they say this is whole environment is being spoiled. There is a basic contradiction sometimes, it is seen, between development and the kind of environment. Even dams spoil environment. It's a question which is difficult to answer, whether you want development or you want to preserve the environment in its virgin form. So you have to decide what you want to do with the people. Chinese currency manipulations, I'm afraid I'm certainly not competent to respond or address to that question. Currency is not my cup of tea, but certainly it's a very difficult question, very important question between US and China relations. We are still not there. And yes, we are taking note of the fact that many of the countries in Asia-Pacific region are willing to have currency relations directly with China, which in a way is pushing the dollar out, pushing that supremacy is being dented. And the Americans are really worried about that. I think they are far more worried about the currency and financial aspects vis-a-vis China than with South China Sea or freedom of navigation, no matter whatever say. So that's what it is. US, then the question of China alienating. China would not want to. I mean, no country would obviously want to alienate somebody, but they have taken a position on strategic issues. Take Vietnam, for instance. After that line and after drawing that line, the Chinese position is that this is our line since 1947, and for us there is no dispute, this belongs to us. In the last 4 or 5 years, what they have said is that the South China Sea dispute has become a part of their core national interests. And they compared it with Tibet, Taiwan, and South China Sea, which implies, and it has some of the media reports have very clearly said, that core interests China would defend even if need be with the use of force. Now, once you say that, the countries affected get rattled, right or wrong, whether you are using force or you are not using force. The fact that this proposition is available has actually instilled a sense of fear in China's neighborhood. Now, they have done a huge cushioning of this through economic relations. For instance, all the countries in the region are very happy that their trade with China is growing, the economies are growing and all that. But on a strategic issue, there is a strong undercurrent of this suspicion. So I would not say that China is doing it deliberately in the sense of knowingly, but this is a consequence. The important point is that China is willing to stand by that consequence. Knowing that the countries are afraid on this count, they do not want to dilute their position which they have taken. That's why the whole question of South China Sea Code of Conduct is hanging, in real sense, is hanging fire. And that's why these problems are coming up again and again.
I'll ask Surya to respond quickly to the last question on whether ASEAN-India relationship built on its own momentum rather than response of fear of this and that. Yeah.
To that specific question, the answer is very simple, that, also equally profound, that India and ASEAN can have and do have, to a considerable extent, a relationship which runs on its own steam, not so much with reference to China alone, although on specific issues of some economic matters, ASEAN countries do tend to compare and contrast China because they think that they have got a better deal from out of China than from out of India. Only in that limited context, but certainly it's not in terms of seeing India as a potential counterweight to China in security terms, although at one stage it was at the back of the minds of some ASEAN countries, certainly. In fact, ASEAN itself was founded in the context of China being what it then was in the international arena with reference to the US. So in that sense, it has a momentum of its own, India-ASEAN relations. But just one more point about whether China is feared or whatever. My own view is that, China has been showing signs of what may be described as anti-gravity rise in the context where the rest of the economies of the world, the major economies of the world are not doing all that well. China still seems to be, pushing ahead somehow. I mean, I don't know how it is doing it, but then it's for the Chinese to know. So in that context, people meaning the other countries, have some concerns about China, not necessarily a fear of a Chinese invasion day after tomorrow. But then I think China does send out mixed signals for the simple reason that China does not want to lose out on its own anti-gravity rise, whatever others may think or wish to think. That's all I can say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. Well, I believe we've had a very lively start to this symposium. Excellent presentations and also very good engagement from the floor. We'll need to pause for lunch. Now, today's program is very tight, so I'm afraid we have to keep time. We have to pause for lunch, and then we'll come back after lunch for the second session, which will focus on economics, and this will perhaps explain the kinds of economic dynamics that drives India-ASEAN relations. So I'll hand over, before I hand over to the MC, let me invite you all to join me in thanking our panelists for the excellent presentations. Over to you.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, everyone, for the stimulating discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now break for lunch. As we will be rearranging the room, may I request that you take all your belongings and writing materials with you. The buffet line is set up at the Mumtaz Hall just next to this function room. Both vegetarian and non-vegetarian items are available. Kindly be back for the next session by 1:45 p.m. Please enjoy your lunch.